Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the flexibility inventory for Western resource planners. My name is Jo Seal at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and it is my pleasure to present today with you with Andrew Mills. We will have a listen-only mode audio conference with you. You will be able to see the webinar slides via the ReadyTalk interface, but you will not be able to talk directly to us. Instead, we would like to ask you to submit any kind of questions or comments that you have on our presentation via the chat function in the chat box, and we will then later on turn to those questions in the Q&A session of this presentation. It is now my pleasure to hand over the mic to Andrew Mills.
All right, good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar describing this recently released report on a flexibility inventory for the Western resource planners. As Jo said, I'm Andrew Mills, a staff research associate at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and with Jo, we co-authored this report together. From the start, I wanted to acknowledge the Department of Energy Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability for funding this work. And as Jo said, we'll have time for some Q&A and discussion after I conclude some of these remarks. To begin with, I'll define some terminology before describing the motivation and scope of the project. The idea of a flexibility inventory is to create a quantitative estimate of the capability of resources in a portfolio to provide operational flexibility and compare that to the need for flexibility. We quantify flexibility supply and demand using a high-level methodology that was developed by the International Energy Agency in a report they called Harnessing Variable Renewables and is available online for free. We used their approach as a starting point and made some modifications to make the approach better suited to conditions in the Western U.S. The flexibility supply part of the inventory is an estimate of the capability of generation or demand to change in response to system needs. Since this capability depends on how much time you have to make the change, we quantify flexibility supply for several distinct timescales that are relevant to decision-making in power system operations. Flexibility demand, on the other hand, represents the system need for response. We estimate it based on the amount that the net demand could change over the different timescales and the degree to which those changes can be forecast. In addition, we also include contingency reserves as part of that flexibility demand. The title of the report includes a focus on resource planners in the Western U.S. The reason is that the flexibility inventory was designed to use information available in a database of planned resources that have been identified in a utility IRP. This database has an interactive web interface and is located at resourceplanning.lbl.gov. The database was designed and maintained by Pete Larson and Juan Pablo Carballo at LBNL. This database is continuously being updated as new IRPs are released. The flexibility inventory can take any portfolio of resources or a collection of portfolios from that database and then estimate the flexibility supply and demand over the full planning horizon. That brings us to the motivation for this project. We know from renewable integration studies and experience operating systems with growing shares of renewables that renewables increase the need for power system flexibility. Historically, flexibility has not been systematically evaluated in utility planning studies, though there are increasing examples where it is considered. We wanted to develop a high-level screening tool that could evaluate the flexibility supply and demand to help identify cases where the increased need for flexibility would warrant additional detailed study. Alternatively, this tool could show also that future flexibility supply and demand does not appear to be dramatically different than it is today, perhaps lessening the urgency for additional detailed studies. The flexibility inventory provides such a screening level assessment of flexibility out over the planning horizon of the utility. By estimating flexibility over multiple years, we can help identify trends in the balance between flexibility supply and demand as the share of variable renewables is increased. The other benefit of using a common method and database of utility IRPs is that we can compare flexibility inventories across utilities. Neighboring utilities with a surplus or deficit of flexibility might be able to find opportunities to collaborate. Given that this is a high-level assessment of flexibility and not a detailed analysis, we wanted to be clear about what the flexibility inventory can and can't do. Since we use the database of utility IRPs, we're looking only at the flexibility supply and demand from planned resources. The original IEA methodology was used to look at the feasibility of increasing shares of renewables, but instead we focused just on an assessment of planned renewables. But following the IEA methodology, we quantify flexibility in supply and demand in 4 particular intervals that stretch from 15 minutes to 36 hours. And then we focus on that interval that is found to be the most limiting in terms of the ratio of flexibility, supply, and demand. Since this is a high-level assessment, we rely on simple parameters to estimate the flexibility supply. Similarly, we use a statistical estimate of variability and uncertainty to quantify the flexibility demand. This approach that we use leaves out many layers of detail that would be used in integration studies. For example, the flexibility inventory doesn't consider the economics of new resources, and so it can't be used to determine which sources of flexibility should be added, if any. There are other examples of models that are more indicative for those types of cases, like E3's reflex model, on the other hand, which can evaluate the relative economic implications of flexibility. We focus on the capability of resources to provide flexibility, but we don't consider the cost of providing that flexibility. We saw in one recent flexibility assessment from Puget Sound Energy, a utility in the West, that they are concerned with this cost of providing flexibility. That's something that's outside the scope of our analysis here. We also wanted to be clear that this isn't a substitute for a detailed evaluation of flexibility, supply, and demand. Any one individual utility will likely have better tools and data to conduct a flexibility assessment. This is just a screening level assessment using public data that's better for looking at trends and relative differences. As such, we don't conduct any hourly or sub-hourly dispatch and commitment of the system as used in some detailed integration studies. So next I'll provide an overview of the flexibility inventory methodology before presenting results from a case study that we did with a number of actual IRPs that are in this database. In our methodology, flexibility supply comes from 4 different types of resources. It can come from conventional thermal and hydro resources, demand response, energy storage, and transmission interconnection. To estimate the amount of flexibility that can be provided by thermal and hydro, we consider parameters like ramp rates, minimum generation levels, and startup times. Also following the IEA methodology, we also consider the way that the plant will be typically dispatched when it's needed to provide flexibility. There's a lot more detail in the report, but in general the idea is to consider the starting point of the plant when it's needed. Will it be offline and required to start up when it's needed, or will it be online somewhere between its minimum and maximum generation level? This typical dispatch parameter depends on the time interval in question, so it's different for considering flexibility over 15 minutes than it is for 36 hours. And it also depends on the direction that we're talking about. It's different from the up direction versus the down direction. We base this approach on the IEA methodology, but the parameters that we use come from historical observations of typical dispatch of generators in different regions of the West. For demand response, we consider different levels of controllability and notification periods. For energy storage, we assume that it's very flexible based on descriptions of pumped hydro plants currently used in the West. For transmission, we consider transmission capacity from one region to the next to be a source of flexibility supply. But we limit the ramp rates across transmission based on historically observed changes in flows across the interties. Our logic is that if changes have been observed in the past, then we can expect them to contribute to flexibility in the future, at least at the same rate. Now, on the other hand, flexibility demand depends on the variability and uncertainty of the net demand. We characterize the variability of load, solar, and wind over these different time intervals, along with the correlation between the different sources. And we did this based on 4 different data sets from regions in the West. We then calculate the net demand variability for a portfolio based on its peak load, its solar capacity, and its wind capacity in the portfolio. We follow a similar approach of using these statistical parameters and then the capacities in the portfolios for uncertainty using forecast errors that have been reported in the literature. We assume that forecast errors between different sources are uncorrelated, or very close to being uncorrelated. Finally, we assume that contingency reserves equivalent to 6% of the peak demand have to be met in each of these different flexibility inventories. As we'll show with the case studies, we estimate flexibility supply and demand over the 4 intervals of 15 minutes, 1 hour, 6 hours, and 36 hours, both in the up and down direction. The up direction means that we're looking at the capability of generation to increase output or to curtail load, while the down direction means the capability of generation to decrease its output. We focus on the interval where the ratio of flexibility supply to demand is the smallest and call this the binding flexibility interval. The ratio of flexibility supply to demand in that interval is called the binding ratio. When a region has a flexibility supply, surplus of flexibility supply relative to flexibility demand across all intervals, then that binding ratio will be above 1. With this flexibility inventory approach, we can track this binding ratio over the planning horizon for any portfolio in that resource planning portal database to gauge trends in flexibility. So to demonstrate this approach and to better understand some of the drivers of flexibility supply and demand, we conducted a case study based on a set of IRPs in that database. We selected 2 utility IRPs from different regions with different mixes of renewables. One in the Pacific Northwest, where wind is the primary variable renewable resource, and the other in the desert Southwest, where solar is the primary resource. We also conducted this flexibility inventory for a collection of IRPs in those 2 regions, and included in that collection was those particular utilities that we focused on. So we start the flexibility inventory using our base set of parameters and assumptions, but then we conducted 2 different sensitivity studies to better understand the drivers of flexibility. The first, the parameter sensitivity, changes 1 key parameter at a time and then measures the change in the binding ratio. This helps to identify key parameters and assumptions that drive the results. We have a capacity sensitivity that increases or decreases the capacity of an individual resource by 1% of the peak demand. This capacity sensitivity helps us to show which resources contribute the most to increasing flexibility supply or reducing flexibility demand. This slide just summarizes the load and renewable capacity identified in the IRPs for the 2 utilities in the 2 regions that we focus on. You can see that the Northwest has more wind while the Southwest has more solar. One thing to note about these particular IRPs is that they're not necessarily representative of the higher renewable deployment levels that are seen in some states with high renewable targets, though we did examine some cases where we greatly increased the share of renewables in order to see the impact on the results. So now starting to go through some of these results, these figures here show the results of the flexibility inventory for each of these portfolios just focusing on the year 2020. The left column of charts is the individual utilities. The right column are the regional collection of the IRPs. The top row here is the Pacific Northwest, which includes the one utility we focused on, Puget Sound Energy, and then the collection of IRPs in the Pacific Northwest. The bottom row is the Desert Southwest, where our one utility is NV Energy, and then we have the collection of utilities in the Desert Southwest. On each individual chart, the horizontal axis represents the flexibility inventory with starting with the shortest on the left and the longest on the right. The vertical axis shows the flexibility supply in green and the flexibility demand in red. The up direction is all the positive numbers, while the down direction is the negative numbers. So in each case, what we see is that the flexibility demand is greatest over the longer intervals of 6 to 36 hours. That's when we can expect the largest swings in demand, wind and solar, and have the hardest time forecasting it accurately. But we also have lots of time to change the output of resources over these longer time intervals, which also makes our flexibility supply in green also very large over the 6 to 36 hour intervals. We see that flexibility demand is much smaller for the short intervals, but on the other hand, the options for changing output of resources over that shorter time is also much smaller. As a result, we see that the ratio of flexibility supply to demand is actually smallest over this short time interval of 15 minutes. Furthermore, we have additional flexibility demand from the contingency reserves only in the up direction, which makes this 15-minute up direction the binding interval in each of these different cases. So in this slide, we examine the sources of flexibility and supply and demand in that binding interval of 15 minutes in the up direction for each portfolio. Just focus on that 2020 year. And each bar here represents one of those different portfolios. The positive values here show the resources of flexibility supply, the breakdown of those sources, while the negative values show the breakdown of the sources of flexibility demand. In the 15-minute up interval, the contingency reserves are a large source of the flexibility demand, followed then by the net demand variability, and then a smaller share from the net demand uncertainty. A large source of flexibility supply, on the other hand, is ramping of online combined cycle plants, which is shown in orange, in the lighter orange, or changing flows over the interties, which is shown in purple. Ramping online coal, which is shown in black, is also something that somewhat contributes to flexibility in this time frame. In the Pacific Northwest, we see hydro in blue and pumped hydro storage in green are important contributors to flexibility supply. The combustion turbines, which are the darker orange, make more modest contributions since many are offline, and in our base assumptions, we assume that they can't start within that 15-minute time interval. So only those that are online and have some room to maneuver can contribute within this time interval. So next, we can use information from the portfolios to create this flexibility inventory for each year over the full planning horizon. So these charts now have the year on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we show the flexibility supply in green and the flexibility demand in red, just in the binding flexibility inventory interval. The binding flexibility interval is that 15-minute in the up direction for almost all of the years in each of these different cases, and that's indicated above each of the chart. But in a few cases, the binding interval actually changes to the 15-minute down direction, or 1 hour in the down direction near the end of the planning horizon. This explains the jumps in those inventories in those later years. In general, we see that both the flexibility demand and flexibility supply are increasing over the planning horizon. Flexibility demand increases since there's growing load and growing amounts of variable renewables. Flexibility supply increases as the planned generation that's in those portfolios provides some additional flexibility. Finally, we consider the balance between flexibility supply and flexibility demand by calculating this binding ratio. These charts show the year again on the horizontal axis and the ratio of flexibility supply and demand on the vertical axis. The orange line indicates the ratio in that binding flexibility interval, again indicated at the top of each of these charts. The blue lines show the ratio of flexibility supply and demand in the other intervals that are less constrained than that binding interval. And I've labeled just a few of those to kind of give an indication. For most cases, we can see that the ratio of flexibility supply and demand decreases over the planning horizon, since flexibility supply grows at a slower rate than the flexibility demand grows. But the rate of decrease of this ratio isn't that rapid in most of these cases. We should also note that the binding ratio is above 1 in all of these cases, except for this Puget Sound energy, where it's right on the line. And when it's above 1, again, that indicates that we have a relative surplus of flexibility supply relative to flexibility demand. And in this case of Puget Sound energy, we estimated the flexibility supply to be right on line with the flexibility demand. And as we mentioned in a few spots in the report, Puget Sound Energy's own analysis of their flexibility found greater flexibility supply than demand than what we found. and we highlight some of the potential reasons for these differences throughout the report. Another interesting note is that the regional collection of IRPs, that's in the right column, and if we focus this on the Northwest, the regional collection had a flexibility surplus, which indicates that there might be some opportunities for Puget Sound to collaborate with other utilities and utilize some of that surplus flexibility in neighboring areas. So now I'll briefly describe some of the results from the 2 sensitivity studies that we conducted, starting with the parameter sensitivity. So this chart shows the binding ratio in 2020 using our base case assumptions as this open circle in the middle of each of the bars. The purple bars show the extent of the change in the ratio when changing just one parameter at a time over a reasonable range. Individual parameter sensitivities are described in more detail in the report. This just summarizes the overall results that we saw. Now, overall, we see that the results are quite sensitive to some key parameters. In particular, we saw that the greatest increase in the binding ratio occurred when assuming shorter start times for combustion turbines, so making them all quick start, so that they could start within that 15-minute time interval, or changing the typical dispatch of combustion turbines, so starting what changing what their starting point would be, or assuming faster ramp rates for coal and combined cycle plants, and then also faster ramps over the interconnections. We also saw large changes by assuming more controllability of demand response, or if decision makers have greater risk tolerance for large changes in net demand, that also can increase this ratio of flexibility supply to demand. The parameters that decrease the ratio were somewhat similar in terms of ramp rates for coal and combined cycle plants and over interconnections, assumed dispatch parameters, and tolerance for risk. For the capacity sensitivities, we changed the capacity of different resources by 1% of the peak demand, again just focusing on 2020. These charts similarly show the binding ratio in the base case as the black dot, and then the range with the purple bars. And you can see that the range that we see here in this capacity sensitivity is much smaller than the parameter sensitivity. And we see that there's only actually a small subset of resources that really have a substantial impact on the binding ratio. And since the binding flexibility inventory was this short time scale of 15 minutes in the up direction, it was really the fast resources, changing the amount of fast resources, that had the biggest impact. So these resources that had the biggest impact were by changing the amount of energy storage, direct load control demand response, quick start combustion turbines, and quick start internal combustion engines. So overall, we see that in our case, with the case studies that we did here, we saw that the short flexibility inventories were the most constrained, which made these fast resources of flexibility more important in determining the degree of surplus flexibility. We also saw that flexibility up was the more important direction in the majority of cases, owing to this contingency reserve requirement. We saw that the decrease in the ratio of flexibility supply and demand over time was relatively gradual, and that was because our flexibility supply was growing more slowly than the flexibility demand was. We did identify a few opportunities for collaboration where we saw that flexibility was much higher in the overall region than at an individual utility. And if it was needed, the most useful resources for increasing flexibility supply would be this DR, energy storage, quick start CTs, or internal combustion engines. I just want to reiterate, we didn't look at the economics of doing that. This was just to see which ones had the biggest impact on the flexibility supply. Additional analysis would be needed to determine the economic effectiveness of choosing those resources. So in conclusion, we showed that a flexibility of a portfolio could be estimated at a high level, though I do want to have the caveat that the results were quite sensitive to several key parameters. And for our portfolios in our case study, we saw that flexibility is projected to decrease over time, though that rate of decline was fairly gradual. Based on this analysis, we see that there's future work that we could do that could focus on 4 different main areas. So first off, the easiest one is just extending this application of the current methodology to other IRPs in the resource planning portal beyond our case studies. We also see that probably spending time improving the parameters used in the flexibility methodology, particularly those ones that it was most sensitive to, would be a worthwhile investment of time. In addition, the IEA methodology and there are modifications to it, neither of those have necessarily been validated. So doing some sort of validation by comparing this high-level methodology to a more detailed study side by side could help sort of understand what sort of insights we're getting from this study versus what you'd get from a more detailed methodology, and make sure that we're pointing in the right direction. And then also, based on that sort of validation, we could identify ways that this high-level flexibility inventory assessment approach could be improved in future iterations of it. So with that, the full report is available on our website at emp.lbl.gov/publications. You can also download these slides at that website. Also feel free to contact us. I've shown our contact information here, both email and phone is fine. And we will have recorded this webinar, and we'll make it available also on that same report landing page in a matter of days after concluding this webinar. So with that, I again want to thank the DOE Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability for funding this work. And I think at this point, we'll open it up to some of the questions that have been coming through the chat boxes.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that. Great presentation. We have not received a whole lot of questions, so if you have any questions or comments or something is unclear, please do submit your questions via the chat box. One thing that might have been unclear was that a few times you spoke about risk tolerance of operators. Would you mind expanding a little bit on that concept?
Sounds good, sure. So I'll just back up to one of these slides here to give a sense of this. So the demand for flexibility, again, in this chart is shown in the red lines. And that comes from a statistical assessment of the magnitude of changes that we could expect in the net demand over these time intervals. And the way that we did that is that we looked at essentially sort of tail events, so sort of the most extreme changes that we would see. And we defined those extreme changes to be 3 standard deviations away from, or basically it was 3 standard deviations was the magnitude of the change. And so what that means is that if you had a normal distribution, that would sort of capture something like 99.7% of the changes that you expect, and we're sort of only leaving out a very few small subset of those. On the other hand, you could define your flexibility demand to be based on something more like a 95% confidence interval. So you could sort of say, you know, anything that's beyond 95% is something that I don't want to necessarily include in my planning. Those are rare enough and extreme enough events that I won't include those in my planning, that I'm sort of tolerating a greater amount of risk by sort of narrowing the size of what I'm focusing on to just 2 standard deviations and ignoring those other extreme tail events. So that case of going from 3 standard deviations to 2 standard deviations would be something that would essentially represent increasing your tolerance for risk, and the effect would be that you would decrease your flexibility demand. Alternatively, somebody that was very conservative might say, you know, we have to be prepared for the worst case scenario, so we're going to go out to 4 standard deviations or 5 or something like that and really stretch out how far, and that would increase the flexibility demand. So we could change that parameter. We could go through our analysis and just change it from 3 standard deviations to 4 or to 2, and what that represents is different degrees of risk tolerance for a decision maker. And just as an example, again, I pointed to a detailed study that Puget Sound Energy had done. In their case, they focused on a 95% confidence interval. So they were sort of allowing a little bit more risk in that sense and had a lower flexibility demand as a result than we might have calculated.
Thanks, Andrew. One question that was coming in was pertaining to the energy imbalance market, which is trying to maybe address some of these flexibility issues as well. And the person asked whether or not our study considered any kind of impact of this energy imbalance market on flexibility already or not.
So there's 2 kind of different answers that I can give to that. So on the one hand, when we looked at transmission as sort of one of the potential resources for flexibility, we used parameters based on historical observations of flows over intertides. And we basically said if we'd seen ramps over intertides in the past, then that would be what we would limit our ability of the intertides to provide ramping in these portfolios. And so since the energy imbalance market has not been, in our historical record that we used, the energy imbalance market wasn't being used, our parameters don't necessarily reflect what may be something where you might see increasing ramps across intertides going into the future because of that implementation of the energy imbalance market. So what you might expect is if we were to redo the same type of analysis in future years, that if people are using the transmission more for doing faster ramping, that we would see greater parameters, and that would then increase the flexibility supply that we'd see from the energy imbalance market. So that's one answer, is that we haven't really included it, but the parameters could be adjusted to influence or to reflect that. The second answer is that by doing these regional groupings, what we effectively did was we pooled all of the resources in a region. We took every single IRP and we take all of the generators in that IRP and we push that onto the flexibility supply side, and we take all of the renewable resources and we push that onto the flexibility demand side, and we pool all of that together. And effectively what that does is that sort of, assuming that there's no constraints that limit the ability to sort of use generation in that optimal way, reflects to some degree what an energy imbalance market or other sort of collaboration initiatives would be doing. So you could say that maybe our regional inventories reflect more something along the lines of having like an energy imbalance market or some way of increasing collaboration between utilities. So if we go to that comparison of one utility versus the collection of them, maybe that's perhaps a little bit more indicative of what you'd see for energy imbalance market within that region. Now we don't look at sort of the whole broader WEC footprint, but that could be something, again, to do in future studies.
Thanks, Andrew. Another question that was raised was that some have argued that the integration of renewables may be more or the most challenging over long time periods, whereas we have now identified a very short time period of only 15 minutes in the up direction as being the most challenging in our analysis. How would you interpret these somewhat different messages?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely something that we have internally grappled with quite a bit, and have kind of come up with a few different thoughts on that. One of them to start off with is that the quantity of renewables that are in our particular case studies isn't of the same level of some of those studies that might indicate, high amounts of curtailment being an issue. So we haven't, I think the penetration levels are fairly small in these cases. So to start off with, one of the things we did, as I mentioned earlier, is that we just took the renewable portion and we just sort of turned the dial on that. We didn't change anything else in the portfolio. We just cranked up the renewables and we tried to see what would come out, to some degree trying to see if what we would see would be a switch to those longer time intervals. And I don't have any results in here, but one of the things that we saw was that as we increased the amount of renewables in the portfolio, what we saw was that the rate of growth in flexibility demand was faster over those longer time intervals than it was the shorter ones. So if you picture these red lines in here, on the longer time intervals, as we increase renewables, those that sort of red wedge grows faster over the long time intervals, and you could imagine that would cause it to start to quickly, sort of hit up against the green supply side. That said, we also see that the flexibility demand does increase to some degree in those shorter intervals too. So even though we're seeing it grow rapidly in the longer intervals, it does increase to some degree in the short intervals. And so as an end result, we still saw, even in the sort of higher renewable cases that we kind of played around with, we still saw the shorter intervals, more like sort of 1 hour or so, continue to be important. So effectively what we saw was that it became challenging in the long time intervals, but it was still challenging in the short time intervals. And to some degree, that maybe makes sense. So that's maybe one answer, is that you know, if you're dealing with a lot of renewables coming online, it's something that's kind of happening over longer time intervals. Balancing in those short time intervals may still be a challenge. You know, so for one example you could think of is that providing regulation or something like that during a time when you have an oversupply is actually quite challenging, because you're trying to back all your power plants down. So the flexibility supply available during a time when you have sort of surplus generation it can actually still be somewhat binding. So I wouldn't say we necessarily have a conclusive indication that you know, that indicates it's totally different than what the other studies have found, but we see that there's, you know, some interesting things in here that reflects what some of those studies have seen, maybe also some additional information. At the end of the day, though, I would say that this is still kind of a much more simplified method, and that to really dig down into those requires some of these more detailed studies. So I think it adds more food for thought, but wouldn't totally change direction.
Thanks, Andrew. One question that just came in, and I would encourage other people, if they have further questions, to submit them via the chat box, was the question: how would we go about validating this flexibility inventory methodology? What are the next steps, and would there be maybe some collaboration potential?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's kind of two paths forward that I think maybe makes sense. One of them is that a number of utilities, particularly in the West, have really started to grapple with these things in sort of the public forums like an IRP. So for example, in utility IRPs, you do start to see flexibility discussed more concretely in some of the more recent IRPs. One example, again, is Puget Sound Energy in one of their more recent IRPs has an appendix that's devoted to doing this, and I think the Oregon Public Utilities Commission has actually required assessments of flexibility in the IRPs. I think there's other states that have also kind of started to go down that path. So one option is to start by looking at what some of the utilities have been doing for their own systems with their more detailed tools and data sets, and use those in a more sort of comprehensive manner to compare to what we would get using the flexibility inventory. So if we started with the same mix of resources, similar parameters, do we start to get some of the same insight out of it? I think that would be kind of do a side-by-side analysis might be a helpful next step. Another one is that we referenced quite a bit a paper that came out from research, some staff at ISO New England, that is a methodology for doing a flexibility inventory that works with kind of much more detail. So it's something that employs the full sort of dispatch and unit commitment type of logic and hourly dispatch, or you could even shorten it down to 15 minutes or so, and does that full type of detailed study with a focus on trying to quantify both flexibility and demand, looking out over the operating horizon. So it looks out, in their case, I think they did a study from sort of the near term out into 6 hours ahead or something like that. So they kind of create a window of how much flexibility demand might we have over this time interval, and then how much flexibility supply might we have, and they do that with a very detailed study. So that type of very detailed analysis that quantifies in the same sort of terminology and parameters, something that we're getting at here, if we could do some side-by-side analysis with similar data sets, I think we could very quickly verify that we're capturing the right things, or if there's something that's being missed with this methodology. So those are kind of the two approaches, one working with utilities, and the second would be sort of building off of this work from ISO New England.
Thank you, Andrew. One other question was that pertained to the typical dispatch situation of conventional generators, or also the transmission lines, and whether or not if the ratio of flexibility supply to demand would approach 1 or be a little bit below 1, whether that means that all the potential flexibility supply that could be supplied by a thermal generator is in effect used already, or whether it just mirrors historical conventions.
Yes, so so if you take the typical dispatch parameter and you say that that is the correct place to start from, and then you do the flexibility inventory from there and you quantify how much you could move from that starting position over those time intervals, then if you see that the flexibility supply that you could get from that starting point is less than the flexibility demand, that does indicate that starting from that position, you would essentially run the risk of having a deficit of flexibility supply. So that is a correct interpretation of it. Now, the question of, do those typical dispatch parameters that we've used in this analysis reflect sort of the right starting point to begin with? I think that's the biggest challenge that we had with this. So the typical dispatch parameters that we have in this analysis were based off of looking at historical dispatch of generators, looking at sort of, we had a few years record of thermal power plant output during different load conditions, and we sort of characterized that data set using these typical dispatch parameters. So we're building off of historical dispatch of power plants as that starting point. And I think you could very much make the case that had an operator known that they were going to be entering into a period where supply and demand might be very tight, that they could pre-position the system in a different way, so change that dispatch to enable them to provide more flexibility than historically they have done during those times. And so that's something that that we do not capture in this, and is sort of reflects potentially some real options that an operator might have to sort of enhance flexibility supply. I think that type of assessment of what's the true flexibility supply that you have is something that you may need one of these more detailed tools in order to really get at this. This IEA methodology really kind of expects you to provide a static typical dispatch parameter to it, and we sort of base that off of historical performance to do that. But I think we did see in the sensitivities that the choice of that does have a fairly important impact, and so getting that right is an area that we think that there could be more work done on, and that's an important area. The other question is, as you change the portfolio, so as you're adding more renewables or as you're changing your mix of combined cycle plants or combustion turbines to coal plants, things like that, that typical dispatch just for that reason may also change into future years, and we don't account for anything like that. So in order to have kind of a more dynamic typical dispatch parameter, you would need some sort of dispatch logic to be included in there, so some sort of like hourly dispatch or something, and that's something that we don't have in there currently. And again, maybe from a validation, we'd find that that's something that's necessary to kind of make this more useful on a going forward basis.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, for the answering of all these questions and for presenting our work here. As we mentioned earlier, the report was already released a week ago and is available for download on our website at emp.lbl.gov, along with the slide deck that we used today in order to present our findings to you. If you have any further questions or comments or ideas, please do not hesitate to contact us. Our emails are found both on the report and in the slide deck. And with that, we will conclude the webinar for today. We thank you very much for your attention, attending this webinar, and wish you a great day.
All right, thank you guys.